Good morning, and welcome to the CGIAR Fund Office seminar series. This is our third in this series, and we will obviously continue with the various lectures on this. Today we are delighted that the CEO of Consortium, CGIAR Consortium, Frank Rijsberman, is here with us. The topic, as you have seen, is Reinvigorating Global Research on Agriculture, an update on CGI reform. The seminar and the session will be chaired by Jonathan Wordsworth, who is the Executive Secretary of the CGIAR Fund Council. And just for your information, the entire proceeding is being video recorded and will be uploaded on the CGIAR Fund office, CGIAR Fund website. So with that, I hand it over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Iftikhar, and welcome everybody this morning to what we very much hope and expect will be a very productive session, a session which will provide a lot of information, a session which will give you opportunities to ask questions, discuss, raise issues which are brought up by Frank during the presentation. Now, some of you may be aware of the CGIAR in general. I hope you all are. Some of you may be less aware about some of the quite profound changes that have taken place over the last 2 or 3 years during this reform process. This will obviously be got into in much greater detail by Frank as he addresses the subject of reinvigorating global research on agriculture in the context of an update on the CGIAR reform. Now, we're really very privileged to have Frank with us this morning. He started as the CEO of the CGIAR Consortium something like 2 months ago, or possibly slightly less.
One day less.
His feet have barely touched the ground since that date. He's been extremely active and done an awful lot of travelling. I think he comes straight to us today from East Africa.
West.
Well, East and West Africa, where he's been for the last week or so. Frank is no stranger to the CGIAR. During his very illustrious career, both in public sector, in private sector, and in philanthropic foundations, Frank was at one time Director General of one of the CGIAR centres, IMI, the International Water Management Institute, based in Sri Lanka. So he had a period there. So he knows the CGIAR from the inside, and also knows the CGIAR very much from the outside, as a donor and as a partner through various organisations where he's been involved. And now he's back with us in the CGIAR in a different role, now that we've got the consortium established, with its board, with its chair, and with a CEO and its office in Montpellier. So there are a lot of very interesting things that happened. So let's start by giving Frank a very warm welcome, and then we'll turn it over to him to spend the next 35-40 minutes on a presentation, and then we'll open it up to dialogue, discussion, and please don't hold back on the questions. I think that will be a very fruitful part. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. Indeed, I have started 2 months ago, the 28th of May, so 2 months minus 1 day. We're still counting the days. And I've visited 6 of our centers in that period, in Mexico, CIMIT, in Peru, CIP, in Colombia, CIAT, in Benin, Africa Rice, in Nigeria, where I indeed just came from, IITA, and yesterday IFPRI. And indeed yesterday at IFPRI I held, in essence, the same seminar for a rather large crowd, and I see 2 people who came back for more punishment. I do have to warn you, it is basically the same story, so feel free to leave if you've had enough. I've only developed basically 2 stump speeches by now, one for an external audience and one for an internal audience. And frankly, I was a bit stumped today because you're a bit of both. The World Bank knows the CGIAR very well in principle, but not all of you, obviously. There might be a very large percentage of bank staff who have never really heard of the CGIAR or never really thought about it much. So I was kind of curious to ask you how many of you feel that you're really quite familiar, or rather how many of you feel that you're not quite familiar with the CGIAR? Could you raise your hand if you're not familiar with the CG? Okay, that's 5 of you. Okay, that's good to know. I'll try not to shower you with acronyms and other insider talk. And then we've gone through this big reform, and yesterday at IFPRI I had a lot of people there who were actually intimately involved in that reform, as of course Jonathan is, and Mark Kackler knows all about that as well. But among you, are most of you, well, can I have another show of hands of people who are not familiar with the reform of the CGIAR? Okay, okay, most of you. So I will indeed not just comment on the reform, but introduce some of those ideas to you as well. See where we can take it from there. Thank you. Well, I have to say, in the first place, this reform, to me, as a relative outsider, I'm Dutch and I live in Montpellier. I've floated around the world, but in my about, I guess, 33 years, I've really only worked 7 years with the CGIAR, and the rest not even in agriculture. So when I left the CGIAR in 2007, I went to Google, and then I went to the Gates Foundation, and the last 5 years I mostly worked as a donor, but mostly on health. So I really also didn't know much about the reform. When I came back, I applied for this position. I read through all the documents, and I was quite impressed. I must say, 5 years ago, when I left the CGIAR, if people had asked me to put money on all the changes that happened, the 15 centers coming together and signing a constitution to be represented by a single organization, the consortium, and a single board, forming a single portfolio of 15 research programs instead of that quilt of about 3,000 projects that were the primary work of the CGIAR before, I would not have put money on it. I would probably have bet against it. And likewise, by the way, the World Bank always had this role of, in a way, uniting the donors and being the donor of last resort, as it, I think, was called officially. Now there is a fund where 60-odd donors have really banded together, and a surprisingly large amount of money has been put into this fund. You all managing trust funds and so on would know that having $400 million put into a fund like that by a very large number of contributors in more or less its first year of operation is quite a feat. So I think the basic structure of this reform is quite sound, is quite revolutionary for how the whole system works, and my hat off to people who did that. So I won't claim any, if you like, credit for that. In a way, I feel that as for me, who are now put into, in a way, the driver's seat with the consortium to try and sort of get this reform over the finish line, a lot of good tools have been put in the toolbox. It's kind of there. On the other hand, we are very aware that there are major challenges. I'll speak to you about that a little bit. Food security really is back on the agenda. And the question is the CGIAR ready? Was the reform enough? Did it do enough? And certainly, I think I hear critique from the outside. I hear critique from the inside. We're quite aware that it might be 80, 90% finished, but to get the benefits, the other 10, 20%, the last mile, the final inch, is quite critical. So while kudos off to all the reforms so far, we are very aware that we have a lot of homework and that it's quite urgent because people are getting impatient. I mean, the people who have been involved in this reform are getting impatient to see results. So I'll spend quite a bit of time with you also later today to say what are the key priorities that we have in the consortium. Some of those are my priorities in the sense that I'm not speaking yet of policy that, you know, the Fund Council that Jonathan is secretary of has approved or that the Funders Forum has endorsed. We have key meetings in October of this year in Punta del Este when those groups come together. So quite a few of the things I'll speak to you sort of as priorities are in fact the things that are currently in prep and it will be proposed to the Fund Council and Funders Forum in October. So I'm speaking to you with that proviso that in a way some of those ideas are what we are trying to gather support for. So if you disagree with them, actually, there's still a chance to provide your input and to be part of that discussion and consultation that we have on all of those ideas going forward. So I'll speak about what very much was my very first priority when I came into the job, and that is, I call it performance management. And for insiders, you know, that includes a very important priority that the donors already gave back to the consortium. Is make sure that priority setting, better metrics, is what we want to see from you. I am sort of absorbing that into what I think is a slightly larger topic to say, yes, better metrics, priority setting, also making sure we have real value for money, and ideally that we move to a system where we fund performance, that we pay for results as opposed to paying for, in essence, reimbursing expenditures. If performance is the first priority, the second is absolutely partnerships, and I'll talk quite a bit more about that. And a big promise of the reform was that the CGIAR would be more open, would be better at partnerships with the national systems, with the private sector, with civil society. And I know that that promise is in a way still unfulfilled. In fact, there is a very big gap between the center's self-perception of how good they are at partnerships, which is what I generally hear when I visit around, and a pretty harsh critique on the outside where people say the CGIAR is not good at partnership. So I'll tell you a bit more about our position there as well, and I'll talk to you briefly about a number of cross-cutting issues that are of concern to many of you. So yes, in a way I just reviewed this with you. There is a CGIAR consortium, an actual constitution signed by the 15 centers, a single organization. Quite important. It means for donors, for instance, that they now can approach us in the consortium and say, rather than having deals with each individual center, can we have one agreement with you? And that is indeed feasible. That is a very direct benefit for donors. It also means indeed centers that in principle have much lower transaction costs if we have 15 programs that in a way are a portfolio approach rather than individual projects. We're not quite there yet. We don't expect that we end up with 15 projects, but we do expect that we would go down from say 3,000 to maybe 300, meaning 15 programs plus a number of hopefully large-scale bilateral projects from donors who can't contribute to the fund, from the USAID mission in Nigeria, for instance, who aren't going to contribute to a global program because their mission is really either national or regional. So they could make complementary bilateral investments in essence, the same programs with a more limited scope. So there will be bilateral projects, but hopefully a much smaller number. Now the CIRAD representative is in the room here, the CIRAD representative in Washington, and that reminds me that in my first week in Montpellier, where we're now based, our neighbors are CIRAD, and I had a lunch meeting, nice French lunch. I mean, Dutch people eat sandwiches and have a glass of milk for lunch, as you know. I had a proper French lunch with a glass of wine on the edge of a little river. And Henri Carcelade, who is now a board chair, and he's a bit older, but he's an illustrious person in our circles. He said, did you know about the reform of the CIRAD system? I said, no. I said, in the 70s, CIRAD was actually 13 independent centers. And I was actually the person who did the reform. First we had a consortium, then we had 7 programs, now we have 1 organization. And he said, and then Sarkozy fired me and I went to FAO, but footnote. But he also said, which stuck in my mind, that took about 20 years. And these pretty large-scale reform processes, while people who are involved in them are sick and tired of them after a few years, and I get that a lot, like, are we done yet? I mean, are we finished? In the end, it's a fairly wholesale change of culture across an organization that is global, has 8,000 staff, has a history of 40 years. So really, it'll take a bit longer before this has all settled down, and that's not unreasonable. So I'm partly trying to say, for you or for donors or people in the system, we have to have somewhat realistic expectations of how much time it will take to really have this move into a single organization with a single culture and operating smoothly across institutional boundaries. Why is it necessary? Well, you know this very well. I mean, for many, the 2007, is it, World Development Report on agriculture was one of the first that put this back on the map. A bit of foresight there, of course. The food rise, the rises in food prices, the price spikes of 2008, 10, 11 were really a very harsh wake-up call for all the people who felt that food was no longer a problem. And some people would say that this was partly, a result of the success the CGIAR had through the Green Revolution. I mean, at least that was a key factor in having relatively abundant and low food prices, and people thought we didn't need to invest in agriculture. And indeed, in places like this one, support for agriculture had fallen quite drastically. And in organizations like the CGIAR, you could feel that result. I mean, a couple of decades of flat budgets, meaning de facto declining budgets really, means you're always in a situation where you have to fire staff, where you have to scrimp, where you can't invest, it gets people to quite defensive mindset. And the CGIAR, if we felt that was bad, go to the National Agricultural Research Systems. Many of them are in a much worse state. Of course, a few exceptions. Embrapa, the Kenyan Agricultural Research, Embrapa in Brazil, Kenyan Agriculture Research System, India, China. Those countries that really invested in agriculture are today reaping the benefits. We usually use Brazil as the key success story of how a country can benefit from a sustained and smart investment in agriculture general, led by science and technology driven innovation through an organization like Embrapa. But most of the others were in a pretty dire state. Luckily, as you all know at least as well as I, food security is back on the agenda. And when I visit ministries now, often they say, look, our overall ODA budget very much under pressure. However, food security, our #1 priority. That's the case in the Netherlands, for instance. So in fact, it is possible to get increased support against a tide which is generally declining support for ODA. So, well, we can't be happy about it because the reason is, of course, pretty severe. Your own estimates, I think, said that these food price spikes pushed some 44 million people into poverty. So that's a sad situation, but it does mean that this subject is a new priority. And I'll show you what the real issue is. Doesn't this look good? Steady increases in yields that are sustained, you would say. True. But for the economists in the room, and there might be a few, you know that this was a pretty decent percentage increase in the 60s, some 3%, which was good enough, if you like. But the same now is like a 1% increase, just because the same 64 kilos over a lower base or a higher base is just a smaller amount. And it's not enough. If we look at how much we need, so IFPRI's type modeling says we need at least 0.5% per year more of yield increase for a food secure future. On top of that, not as obvious, but by now quite clear in the mind of many, is that this steady increase is in fact stagnating for a number of crops. Now that lands us in really deep doo-doo. If this is really true, and Ken Kasman, the chair of our science council, strongly believes so. Papers out in Nature show that this is actually happening. It's still a bit new, it's somewhat controversial, but I feel that most scientists now believe that there is indeed a slowing of these steady increases, which obviously exacerbates what I just told you. So what does that mean? Well, whatever particular scenario you want to pick makes for slight changes in that number, but the overall conclusion of all experts, whether it's FAO or here, is that we need a very substantial increase in our food production by 2050 to partly feed the growing population. And the other big trend, of course, is with changing tastes, increasing incomes in places like India and China, as they shift from a more vegetarian to a more meat-intensive diet, the amount of food that needs to be produced goes up much sharper than just by population increase. So we're getting, there's other scenarios that speak about doubling for key crops, but at least 70% more. So if at the same time the yields are plateauing and the prices of food spike, what do farmers do? They plow like hell. They plow land under, in our assessment, faster than even during peak times during the Green Revolution. So agriculture it has to go one of two ways, right? Either we get more per hectare, we intensify, or if not, we have to expand the area. So farmers that don't see an opportunity to have increasing yields, they'll go the other way. They'll plow under fallows, they'll move into forests, they'll go into marginal areas. It's going fast. So not only for a food security reason, surprisingly from an environmental perspective, for a long time environment and agriculture were sort of on different sides of the fence. While in Rio+20 it was pretty obvious. Environment has figured out that agriculture is its new best friend. Us in ag research, if we don't somehow manage to up the productivity, if we can't intensify in an ecologically acceptable manner, sustainable intensification, absolutely, then the footprint is going to be pretty disastrous. So even very respectable environmental organizations are now considering to invest in agriculture intensification. That's definitely new. Why not just through the private sector? I hear this argument a lot. I mean, clearly the kind of budgets that we have in public research on agriculture are dwarfed by those of the private sector. Why doesn't Monsanto do this? Why don't the other companies do this instead of us? Why do you still need to invest in this? Well, the answer is not that complicated. I mean, it's a bit the same as for diseases. Big pharma companies invest in the diseases of people that can pay their products. So there it's pretty obvious. It's cancer, it's cardiovascular diseases. It's not neglected tropical diseases. For agriculture, the argument isn't as obvious because yes, there are corn farmers in Nebraska that are very well served by private research, and there are small corn farmers in Africa that frankly aren't well served by private research because their diseases are different, their challenges to market are different. So while they have the same crop, smallholder farmers in Africa are not served by private sector research in the same way as big pharma doesn't serve what used to be called neglected diseases until some people like Bill Gates got in there and started to mobilize quite massive money for that. We need a bit more of that for agriculture as well. And frankly, Bill Gates has seen that. Bill Gates, after investing massive amounts of money in health, has picked on development as his second priority, and within that on agriculture as by far his largest priority. Because agriculture is the best way out of poverty for rural poor, because food security and malnutrition is so closely intertwined with health, it doesn't make sense to put vaccines in kids' mouths who are malnourished, who are having diarrhea, and therefore not taking it. So nutrition is what ties agriculture and health together. And it is why private research in agriculture is of course important, and it will help the corn farmer in Nebraska, who has a key role in providing enough overall food for the world economy to help keep food prices down. And yes, this year the droughts in the Midwest may very well lead to another crisis in prices that push people into poverty in Africa. But to really focus on smallholders, that's still a public research function. So what will it take? There's lots of scenarios on that. If Priest, for instance, says that on the research side of things, to get that extra 0.5% in yield growth on average for staple food crops, the system like the CGIAR, its share of the overall research agenda, the public research agenda, should be about $1 billion next year, growing to 1.6 in, did I get that base year right, 2020, or was it 2025?
There's a bit of a margin around that number, 2025.
And of course, that's only a small part of it. We don't kid ourselves thinking that research is going to do it alone. It might, well, we obviously think it's a key part of the engine that drives innovation, but it won't deliver results to farmers if there aren't also roads constructed, seed sectors that work, government policies that actually allow farmers access to market, quality control system, so there is no aflatoxin in products, so the EU will actually buy the groundnuts from African farmers and so on. So there's a lot more to it than just improved varieties, and there's a lot more money required for this. I mean, you know this all rather well. I mean, in this audience, I would expect I don't need to explain that. And we have changed our approach a little bit as well. It really is much more holistic intensification. Yesterday I had Monty Udelman in the seminar, who explained that he, with McNamara, was there when the Ford Foundation came calling and said, we can't support this thing on our own anymore. We really need the World Bank to come in with us. At that time, it really focused on the high yield varieties. Today, while there's still an incredible promise from the life science revolution, 5-6 years ago when I left the CGIAR, we were all talking about the potential of marker assisted selection, molecular breeding, molecular biology. I go around these centers today, everybody uses that. Very quickly that has become commonplace. On the other hand, while, say, the life science revolution, understanding the DNA of almost everything you see, has transformed medical science, it is only just beginning to touch agricultural sciences. So we actually expect a pretty revolutionary change in what science is all about, including difficult conversations around GMOs and so on. But yes, we expect a lot of change in the actual science around bred germplasm, the ability to generate drought-resistant varieties, disease-resistant varieties, varieties that deal well with climate change. We are very aware that that can only produce impact if that happens within a system that delivers those varieties to farmers, through seed companies, to the market, through government policy, and a series of other things that go with that. So just here affirming that we are quite aware that just doing better varieties isn't the answer. So what we do now have is, for the first time, something called the SRF, usually an acronym, the Strategy and Results Framework. I would have to say it's more a strategy than it's a results framework today. We went through a few cycles of this. For those of you who know, there was an early version which was a typical IFPRI product. And if you've seen IFPRI products, that was a modeled version, lots of numbers. People said, rather theoretical. So another attempt was made, and the pendulum swung rather far to a mostly narrative-based version that does a very good diagnosis of where we are, doesn't give us very clear targets, and certainly not any numerical ones, on where we should go. So we're going to try and swing that pendulum halfway back and try and have better metrics on our targets, better metrics for these programs. But we have developed a fairly consistent set of CRPs, CGIAR research programs, that you see here, that address 4 key things: reducing rural poverty, improving food security, improving nutrition and health, and sustainably managing natural resources. Those are the 4 dimensions, if you like. We haven't quite set our ambition level in a sort of MDG style, like how much contribution can we as a CGIAR make to these challenges. And we haven't quite asked our CRPs to express clearly how much of a contribution each of those can make to any of those 4 dimensions. So that's, in a way, next up. We don't have separate programs for gender, or capacity strengthening, or for partnerships, all of them key issues of concern. So we expect to have those mainstreamed, using that buzzword, across this portfolio. And if you are familiar with that particular concept, you'll quickly realize that's nice, but of course the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we have to know then that there are indeed real activities for these mainstreamed activities, and that there are real budgets and so on. So we're aware of that, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So we've talked about what the outside challenges are, that they're frankly enormous. Many would say that food security is the greatest challenge facing humanity in the next few decades. And I suspect many here in the bank would agree with that. Was the CGIAR ready? Well, we often talk about the glorious past of the CGIAR, and indeed people like Monty Udelman have been around for all of it, if you like, so that is impressive. But over time, particularly in a period where agriculture was deprioritized, there was mission creep. And centers were doing whatever donors were asking them. There was this quilt of 3,000 projects. The centers were competing with each other. They were overlapping. The system was far from effective and efficient, and indeed not quite ready to really tackle large priorities in a streamlined and integrated way. So that was the focus of this reform, to end up with a clear vision, streamlined portfolio, make sure that we can deliver value for money and not duplicate, be efficient. The modern view of how we ought to deliver aid, I would say. It's a clear vision that is in line with the trend of what we see in DFID or in Dutch aid or in USAID or, for that matter, in the bank. So this is another little picture to show that we've come from being a 20 million system to a 600-something million system last year. And the system, of course, went through a range of transformations and reforms. There was Uma Lele in the room yesterday from the bank, who did one of those reviews about 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, on how the system should change. We had a Morris Strong review. We had several reviews who all pointed in the same direction, but the system successfully managed to resist that until 2, 3 years ago, when people like, well, Kathy Scherer here at the helm, and donors like DFID, where Jonathan was at the time, and USAID, were strong enough to push through the reform that we have now. And centers were smart enough to, if not enthusiastically, then at least in the end, fall in line and say, okay, we also see that this is the thing to do. And gradually, when I go around now, 5 out of 6 type of thing, have really bought into this and say, okay, let's get with it. Let's do the right thing. So we have a system now that is a quite pretty picture from a distance, let's say it like that. And then we can look under the hood. Somewhat complex. We have a clear intent to work very closely with partners and stakeholders. I would say that's still a little bit the unfulfilled promise. I'll talk to you a bit more about that. We're working hard to make this consortium a single organization that really represents the 15 centers. We have a single strategy. We can do business as a single organization. We're still waiting for, our host country agreement with France to actually come through their parliamentary system. But they're promising us that it's not going to take the usual 10, 15 years. We'll actually get it this year. So then we are kind of in business. We're only a proper international organization as of like March of this year. So I have to say we are observing, more than the usual diplomatic snail's pace. It's more, Web 2.0 lightning speed for this particular thing. We are also in the process of setting up an independent evaluation arrangement that will be based at FAO. The director has been hired, in process. The fund is here, obviously. You should know all about that. It's at the bank. It's formerly a trust fund. Jonathan can tell you everything about that. Mark and Jürgen Vogele of the Ag Department are all deeply involved in that. And, of course, Rachel Kite is the chair of our fund council. So that part I'll skip, but it's in good health. I'm reassured by everything we hear. And we still have an independent science and partnership council, different name, but for those of you who've been involved in the CGIAR longer, that's the reincarnated TAC, Technical Advisory Committee, almost the same people on it, but certainly a very similar function. But we're working very closely with them. That's our particular Christmas tree. Works quite well. Another way to show our Christmas tree, and you'll see mostly how much partnership is emphasized. And I would have to say that just shows we have to work on that rather harder. This is a slide I actually got from Jonathan. He presented that late May to our finance directors. It shows you we have some windows that go from window 1, which is in essence unrestricted from the donor's perspective, support for the CGIAR system. Window 2 is where the donors say we wanted to go to this one of the 15 programs. Window 3 was originally meant for donors that wanted unrestricted money for a center still. In practice, we see it's more used for, in essence, bilateral projects coming through the fund. So we have to discuss what we think about that. And then there are, of course, still also a large amount of bilateral projects. I'm not showing them here because this was a slide on the fund that Jonathan made. It shows that we are doing quite well in the very first year of operations. And we had rather many contributors to the fund. Of course, a few big ones and a lot of small ones. But that's very typical. Over $400 million in it in the first year and a half or so. Doing well. More importantly, if you remember that prediction that we needed $1 billion in 2013, at the time when that was made, The system was sort of at $400 million and had been stuck there in real terms for a long time. And suddenly, for the last few years, investments are up. Now, I wouldn't, certainly that has everything to do with the rising food prices and the fact that agriculture and food security is back on the agenda. But I would hope that it also plays into this, that the reform has given the donors more confidence that the CGIAR is a good instrument to do something about this particular challenge, because there are, of course, many other ways that this could be done. So we're actually not doing too badly on that target, and seeing even longer term, we're not quite there, so if you have money to spare, that's still a good idea, but on the other hand, it's not too bad, actually. And this does translate into centers being pretty busy. When you go to a place like CIMMYT, it's a construction site, mostly because Carlos Slim has given them a big bag of money to rebuild labs. But then SIP doesn't have a Carlos Slim in its back pocket, but it certainly is growing more than 30% this year, and etc. So it's doing well. At the same time, it may interest you that our overhead costs are going down quite drastically. Properly so. This is a concern from all donors. It's a deep concern of ours. We have to be as efficient as we can be, and we are. As you can see, we are trending towards having 15% overall, which is what quite a few donors consider the maximum, out of which 2% would be our sort of system cost for things like a consortium office and a science council, and 13% for centers. And personally, I believe we should be able to operate quite well within such an average. Partly that is indeed a focus, efficiency drives within centers. Part of it is, of course, also that centers, as they have less sort of large unrestricted amounts, they get smarter, as all good business-like organizations are, and saying, hey, our labs, that's a direct cost for a research project. Why not organize it so that we charge projects for the labs they use? So, we can build that into our direct costs rather than just charging all our labs to our overheads. And of course, as the system grows and centers grow, if they do this smart, their fixed costs should stay lower at least. So it should be easier to operate at lower overhead rates with larger centers. Altogether, this is, I think, important and going in the right direction. So what's still not so good? What do we still need to do? What's our homework? What is the last mile? Well, I already prefaced this a little bit. The SRF, while it's great we have one and that the funders were willing to accept and endorse it, they did say, come back to us in a while with an action plan on what you still need to do, and that action plan is what we are presenting to the Funders Forum in October in Punta del Este. And key things in that are, we need metrics for our system level, we need priority setting, and frankly, they didn't say that, but that's what I add. The system still has such high transaction costs that we still have a risk of over-management, micromanagement, where we originally, going from 3,000 little projects to 15 large ones. We didn't want that. So there are a few things here to which my answer, if you like, is performance management. We'll come back to that. And the CRP portfolio, while it is great we have one, when you sit down with scientists and I ask, look, how is it going to, is it going to deliver these outcomes? I hear a lot, well, it was sort of constructed, 4 centers sitting together and sort of putting together what they had. It was a bit too much constricted, sort of, looking in the rear view mirror based on what we had. Now we'll need to sort of make that switch and turn around and say, okay, fine. Here's $100 million. What can you deliver over the next 5 or 10 years? Show us what those outcomes are. Show us that it's value for money. Create from this thing that sort of puts the whole system together really an exciting investment portfolio that, donors can take to Parliament and say, this is what we're investing in, and this is the reporting, and this is why it's value for money, and this is why we have confidence that this is going to deliver results. So we have work to do there. Particularly, I think the centers, scientists being scientists, gave much too granular. They put a lot of outcomes and milestones in these things, 50, 60, 100 of them in a single program, that are more what I need as a manager to talk to my scientists or what I need to talk to my partners. It isn't what they need to talk to investors at a higher level. They're often the kind of internal outputs. When I spoke to the Gates Foundation and said, are you going to put your money through window 2, the sort of, the fund? He said, look, one of them put together a spreadsheet with all the hundreds of milestones from all of them. And you need to look at it for only 5 minutes and say, I'm not investing in that. Frankly, there are too many sort of small things that say more knowledge on this, more knowledge on that, you know, increase social cohesion. You wouldn't put money on that either. So we did that to ourselves, and we have some homework there to say, you know, frankly, so the Gates Foundation said, if we have $50 million to invest in maize research, do we put it in the CRP on maize, or do we just take it to CIMMYT and negotiate our own side deal? Well, they say, as long as we can negotiate a better deal by taking our money to them direct, we will. However, if the same kind of outcomes that they then negotiate are in our CRP, and if they have confidence in the reporting, you know, they have no legal restrictions against putting their money in the basket. It's what they do in health all the time. And at Gates, as I know well, there are strong pushes to have as few staff as you can. So if they can lower their own transaction cost by funding with others, and if they can say that they leverage other donors' money, just as they do in health, they will. So we have a bit of homework there for ourselves to just show to, I'm just taking Gates because I know them and I had this conversation. I know it's a realistic example. It's the same for others. We have to come up with an investment portfolio that people find attractive and that they can easily defend back home, that this is worth investing in, rather than sort of talking to each other about turf, frankly. So that is what we are about to do between now and the middle of next year, performance management system. And partnership, frankly, as I said, you know, we have to own up. I mean, it doesn't help to, when people tell us we're not good, to tell them, oh, we think we are really good. We have to sort of own up to the fact that the expectations are different, that the perception on the outside is different. We'll do a proper partnership survey, partnership perception survey. What do they think of us? And we'll have to own up to the fact that their perception is our reality. I get you. So I told you this, we'll make the CRPs a focused set of programs that are really attractive. We'll really get to the partners and make sure that we understand what they want from us. And how we'll do many of these things is through the performance management system that we're currently developing, and that is part, for those of you involved in our consultations, part of our SRF action plan. So we currently have a zero draft that's circulating among the centers. We'll share that with the outside world on, we aim, 1st of September. Then it will go around, including here and other funders and partners like GFAR for consultation. It will be discussed at GCARD in Punta del Este, our global conference on agricultural research, and it will then be submitted with comments to the funders forum and hopefully adopted. We'll have a partnership perception survey, and I'm also very enthusiastic about work that the bank is also involved in, the CADEP CGIAR alignment process. I won't speak about it here very long. We had a good session about that at IFPRI yesterday. IFPRI is also quite involved in that. USAID is quite involved in that. Very good work, and a real opportunity for us to align what we do both with the demand for research, but also with people that are investing in agriculture and say, look, we have these innovations. How does that sort of line up with other investments in the sector? How can we do this in countries where governments are actually ready to invest with us and having a better chance of delivering impact? So I can't underline enough that I think that is a key opportunity for us, and we will make more of it. We'll actually have another meeting in Dublin 2, co-organized by David Nielsen, that we look forward to. And if you're interested in gender research particularly, and if you're worried that our mainstreaming the issue was going to sort of make it, you know, go away under the carpet, this same week we're having our gender network meet in Seattle at the Gates Foundation, and there they are reviewing gender strategies. Most of our CRPs will have gender strategies, but more importantly, they're talking about what the real issues are that they feel are productive in sort of basically research agenda development that we'll advise to our programs to pick up, and we'll ask them to come up with real activities and real budgets in next year's work plan and budget, and we'll propose to be approved by our donors in October that we'll do what we will call a gender performance fund, where we will put real money against those programs that take this serious, and we're inviting our donors to also strengthen that pot if they feel that's important. Something similar for agrobiodiversity, another mainstreamed issue. So happens that we have a workshop on that in October. This is something we do generally quite well. We have gene banks, the crown jewels of the CGIAR system. That's for the ex situ conservation. We're also very interested in the in situ conservation. cows you don't necessarily conserve in a gene bank. You might want to make sure that the breeds that are important for diversity are actually out there in nature when we need them. So we will have an approach to that, again, on the table in Punta del Este. In capacity strengthening, another key area that I think we probably let go for a little bit too much. We aim to have at least a draft strategy on the table for that in Punta del Este. As you know, as you'll gather, we have quite a bit of homework between now and then. And absolutely, we'll also have an efficiency drive. It's more our internal homework, but for those of you who were involved in the reform, there was actually a very good report by Accenture consultants in 2009 on shared services across the CG system. And when I came in the office and met with the finance directors, I asked, so why didn't you implement that? Expecting to hear that it was bad, they didn't want to, whatever. I said, yeah, that was actually very good. I'm like, why didn't we implement that? So I don't know why it wasn't implemented, but we sure are looking at that now. We put a committee in place, and we are very interested in doing a lot more shared services. It's a key opportunity, I think, that we haven't made enough of. Better data systems across the system. A lot of things that centers weren't willing to do on their own, a lot of not invented here at that time. Let me just say, for lack of time now, that there's going to be a lot more happening on that front. Wrapping up, ISPC, our Science and Partnership Council, on our request wrote a very nice paper on priority setting that sort of introduces a lot of the concepts that we'll use, sort of harmonize the language on outcomes and outputs and what we mean by them, and gives a lot of good examples to the centers of how we can set these metrics. And we have agreed on sort of a two-level system of priority setting. As we are trying to swing that pendulum halfway back, we won't quite go to a completely model system. ISPC and we agree that in the end this priority setting is, in essence, a political managerial process that takes into account many factors that you don't stick into an impact model. But it should be supported by real scientific data as well. So we'll do that at the system level, working with ISPC, with IFPRI, with others. Very much interested to have some key investors like the World Bank or Gates or USAID who have people who work on this participate in that as well. And we'll work bottoms up in the CRPs as well. A lot more there is actually happening. I will leave it at this for now. I am totally happy to talk more about that during questions. We have a timeline where we're saying, okay, to the centers, we don't have to have everything ready for Punta del Este, but we certainly want to have all these designs and strategies on the table so we can discuss that with our funders and say, do you agree that this is the way to go? So it does mean we won't have everything ready for the 2013 budget cycle, but we should then keep the 2014 budget cycle as our primary target, meaning by sort of mid-2013 we should have this system in place so that it can play a large role in our funding plan for 2014. That's the overall scheme of things. Concluding, we think we are already a long way down the road. I sometimes use this example of if you've built a house, you know that you sink a lot of money into your foundations, walls go up, the roof go up. You might have spent 80–90% of your money. You still don't have a house. You still have to put in tiles and taps and finishes. So the last 10–20% of your investment is what gives you the full pleasure of the house. We're sort of in there. I mean, I very much recognize that people have put most of the heavy lifting in place. We urgently need to do this last mile work to make sure we really enjoy the benefits, share with partners, are clear on what results we are delivering. But there is good news in centers. They're no longer a defensive, stagnant bunch, I can say. They're lively, they're investing, they have modern labs, there is a lot more going on there. They need to open up more. CRPs are beginning to make a difference. You go to centers and they say, scientists say at CIP, at CIAT, in the last year, I've worked more with scientists from other centers than in the 10 years before. I mean, that's anecdotal, but it is changing. Not yet impact on the ground, but certainly culture in the centers, which was a key part of this reform. But we know we have quite a bit of work left to do, so we are definitely not going to be complacent. I was congratulated on my new position, but I also tell you a lot of people extended their condolences because I thought I had an absolutely impossible job. I don't think so. Maybe because I'm overly optimistic, but actually because I see that we do have a way forward, that the tools are in the toolbox, that there is a growing momentum, and that we can make this work. Just in time, because we know there are some very serious challenges out there. Those things on food security that I showed you, they're for real. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Frank, for that really informative, enlightening view from somebody coming in over the last couple of months. Given that you've got so much to do, I'm even more grateful for the time you've been able to give us this morning. And just for everybody's information, Frank's coming over to our office at 11, so we must leave here about 10 to, for a teleconference with 15 Director Generals of the centres all over the world. That's part of the day job. So we appreciate that, Frank. So we've got about 20 minutes to go over some of the points that Frank's made, to challenge some of the issues perhaps, ask questions, get further clarification. So let me open the floor to that, please. Can you, when you ask your question, could you just ask you to mention who you are, please? So we'll start there, please. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Shiva Maki. I'm in the research department here. My name is Shiva Maki. I'm in the research department. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I do understand that you have a challenge in your hands. My question to you is regarding the partnerships with the national agricultural systems and how your sort of vision to transfer CGIAR technologies to the national systems and on to the actual farming situation. I do understand that it's a challenging issue, but it would be nice to know what your ideas or your views are on this. Thank you.
Would you like to take a few?
Shall we take three questions, and then it gives Frank something to bite on? First, you can say if anybody else got a similar issue with the partnerships, the downstream, the working together with partners bringing in their investments, particularly, for example, some of the World Bank programs. Mark.
Thanks, Frank. I'll add my congratulations to your appointment. Delightful having you in the position of CEO. One of the things I thought I might respond to is how you talk about the importance of the CGIAR bringing together the agriculture tribes and the environmental tribes. And as you may or may not know, and as my colleagues may or may not know, just this week, Rachel Kite has formally announced that within the central departments of the World Bank, she's combining the environmental and the agriculture tribes. So in one place, we'll be able to talk about sustainable, productive landscapes, bringing together everything from biodiversity through natural resource management, including livestock, and, of course, farming and agriculture technology and ag research. So this is the way we're trying to evolve, and very consistent with what you and the rest of the consortium are trying to do. I guess my question, it's really maybe a suggestion disguised as a question, has to do with the indicators and looking ahead to the future. We all know the MDGs, and the MDGs will be coming to an end in 2015. And some of us think that we really collectively didn't do a very good job when the MDGs were developed to really get the agriculture, the links to poverty, economic growth incorporated in the MDGs, reflecting a time when agriculture really was not at the top of the development agenda. We do have MDG 1, of course, but that's kind of been about it. Now, as some of you may know, there will be an exercise over the next few years to prepare sustainable development goals. I'm just saying to my colleagues here, using this opportunity to hold the microphone as an excuse, I think we collectively should really try to contribute to the development of sustainable development goals in general. But the consortium, I think, would have a big role trying to keep ag research and then its links to poverty, economic growth, in the forefront so we don't make a mistake the second time, like we did with the MDGs. And I'm just curious, as you develop your SLOs, if there's been any pre-thinking on how to contribute to the development of the sustainable development goals. Thanks.
Okay. We'll take you at the back, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Leslie Elder, and I come from the Health Tribe. I'm the Senior Nutrition Specialist in the Anchor Unit for Health, Nutrition, and Population. And we're reaching out. We are linked very closely now with the Ag team at the World Bank, working on a knowledge platform that is trying to bridge this gap, connect the dots between agriculture and nutrition and food security. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on the thinking around how you're going to deal with your theme on improved nutrition and health outcomes, and also to ask about the role that your mainstreaming of gender in particular will have in solving this issue. Thanks.
Okay, there are lots of hands going up, but can we leave them for a second round and give Frank a chance to respond to those three very interesting questions and suggestions disguised as questions. First one was on national systems and partnerships, linkages there. Second one was indicators, sustainable development goals moving forward from MDGs, and then finally, and the last one, not finally, but the third one, health, agriculture, gender, those platforms and knowledge. How is the CG going to operate on?
So how do we have partnerships with the national systems? Depends a bit. We have definitely different work, sort of different stages of the impact pathway for our sort of upstream work, where it indeed is science and developing improved germplasm. Some centers are still going it more or less alone, but many of them are forming consortia. I mean, when I was at Africa Rice, there's now an African consortium of rice breeders, and many of the trials that Africa Rice does is not just on their own site, it's in much more integration with the actual rice breeders in the strong agricultural systems, and they are building capacity in the ones that aren't as strong to join that as well. Big trend. Next, moving down, what is quite new for the CGIAR is that we have, if you like, come back to farming systems and to agroecological zones as a key focus of our work. So we clearly are still more comfortable in, say, the commodity programs. That's why it's taking us longer to develop a systems program on the human tropics and on dryland systems, and we also have one on aquatic resource systems. But those are really meant to take a farming systems approach. They can take some of those innovations on improved germplasm, and those are be held much more directly accountable for delivering results to farmers. So while the commodity programs might be held accountable for coming up with new varieties that are indeed disease resistant or have higher crop varieties, higher crop yield, the systems one will absolutely have to deliver more development outcomes, and they can only do that in close partnership with at least the national systems inside those systems focused programs, and in many cases also seed companies. Policy is a key part of that. So if you like, in the systems based programs, the partnerships are central to achieving results. We can't do without that. On top of that, we are, as I indicated, very interested in using mechanisms like CADAP to align with national priorities, and we are, of course, very much hoping that the national agricultural systems are part of the CADAP investment plans, that the governments have already taken care that is a mechanism through which we can work with those. And then our centers are also working with many large-scale projects, like USAID's initiatives, Feeding the Future, which are in many cases opportunities to work quite closely with the national systems. Often they are investments in the national systems that CG centers support rather than, say, investments in the CG centers. So there are quite a few opportunities, and we should use all of those. I'm not saying we're doing an excellent job there. I am saying we are prioritizing that, and there are quite a few mechanisms that we will work on very hard as we go forward. When you read that ISPC priority setting paper, it focuses mostly on intermediate development outcomes, both at the system level and for the CRPs. What it doesn't quite do, and what I have started a discussion with ISPC on that I think is helpful, is to also have targets, impact level targets for those 4 systems. And they are, and I talk about them as MDG-like, because we do both of what Mark said. We criticize the MDGs, they weren't good, but they were tremendously influential and you know, streamlined, focused, help investments, rallied the troops on the investor side. So yes, SDGs, I mean, I would say if there were SDGs, we'd adopt them in our field. We won't do those alone. It doesn't make sense, I think, to have our own separate targets. I mean, the key thing here is to line up, you know, it's like a standard, right? The value is how many people adopt it. But if we can help other folks who are likely to take the lead in that, like at the bank and in the UN system, if our centers can contribute to the development of SDGs that really work, that would be very welcome. So yes, we're hoping to see a collaboration there. On health and nutrition, our first health-based program was very much focused on biofortification. It's called Harvest Plus. It's you know, primarily an investment from the Gates Foundation and others. Now we have a CRP on health and nutrition, which is much more health system based and provides more opportunity. Biofortification is one of the elements in there. I would say it's more under construction. It's still led by IFPRI, John McDermott, a vet originally from Canada, who came from ILRI, but he certainly understands health, if you're willing to accept the vet as an almost doctor. So I think that's an opportunity to actually engage with somebody here in town on what the agenda should be. And it's certainly broader. We are interested in pursuing particularly those interfaces between ag and health around nutrition. So it's more an opportunity than a clear approach as we had for Harvest Plus. And it's around the corner here. What does mainstreaming health means? We realize that some crops are, if you like, women's crops, like roots and tubers, for instance. So there, gender isn't something you sort of layer on top, it's sort of crucial. In many of the other areas, when we speak about access to market, we realize women have all kinds of roles. They are very often the farmers, they are very often the people who bring crops to market, who are, you know, play an important role in different parts of the value chain. So when we talk about value chains, when we talk about access to market, very often this has a role of making sure that it actually explicitly takes into account the role of women. And of course, that holds for nutrition as well. I won't have a lot of time to go into this, but if you like, we have a network of folks that are very aware that, you know, women and men prioritize household expenditures differently. So if we talk about, you know, actual food reaching children, then it is important to take that into account as well. Shall I leave it at that to have a few more minutes for other questions also?
Yeah, let me just, I just add one thing to the previous point about how interaction with national systems, with programs on the ground, etc. Doesn't take 30 seconds. When we were in the reform, we talked a lot, and Frank will have seen this in some of the documents, about holding the CGIAR fully accountable for the outputs of research, for technology, for evidence, the evidence base, etc. But being co-responsible with others for outcomes of how that is applied. And I just wanted to mention this to put it in this context, because from the funding point of view, that's where we're looking at the co-investment area. As Frank mentioned, the co-investments in, say, national or regional programs from funding organizations like USAID, for example, big country program, they're not going to come through the fund, but they can go in with the CGIAR to co-invest in those downstream applications, where the CG inputs may be small, but they're really crucial to making sure that this evidence, technology, and know-how gets rolled out.
So in the internal discussions I have with scientists, they usually say, you can't hold us accountable for delivering development outcomes. We can't do this alone. I say, exactly. So we're going to hold you accountable for building partnerships that can deliver these outcomes. And that's what the centers have to understand, that they will be held accountable in a normal, if you know outcome mapping or impact pathways, you all have boundary partners, and we'd better make sure that we understand that we don't just drop our innovations into a black hole, but that we drop it into a pathway that is actually going to deliver those outcomes in partnership. And we will hold the centers accountable for doing just that.
Yeah, thanks. Andrea, and then we'll go there.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Stump in the legal department at the World Bank. So thank you for the presentation. We've been anticipating the new CEO, so it's really great to meet you in this setting. I was privileged to have somewhat of a front row seat on the reform. It's only because the documents were on my desk and in my computer. And I want to emphasize that we really built the reform to be a continual work in progress. And so I appreciate the last mile idea, and we want to emphasize to you that it's a work in progress for as long as you want. We created very efficient mechanisms for the Fund Council and the Consortium together to make the changes, to add to the Common Operational Framework, to do what's necessary to create the additional infrastructure. So my specific question has to do with the centers boards, so the boards of trustees, the different boards that the individual centers have. From my perspective, it's become clear that we didn't do a very good job in accommodating or integrating that structural piece of the CGIAR into the reform. We were very focused on the Fund Council and the Consortium, and it was kind of up to the Consortium to figure out how to handle its internal mechanics. I note that your next meeting is with all the DGs, but there is, the boards themselves have a role here. We felt it very strongly in the intellectual asset policy discussions and realized that there wasn't a really good mechanism to make sure that those views were integrated, on board, accommodated, consulted, whatever it is. So sorry for so long, but the question is really your thoughts, not just in terms of what the consortium is doing, but how the Fund Council, how the fund itself can perhaps interact better, efficiently, and make sure that the boards have their place, whatever it is, in the decision-making, in the consensus building that happens around the different aspects of the reform.
Can I answer that? Because I totally understand your question. Not quite why in the end you say not just what the consortium is doing, because we very much think of the consortium as the 15 member centers. And indeed, the boards of the member centers have noticed that you had kind of ignored them in some of those documents, and we have a regular discussion on that. And what Jonathan summarized as my call with DGs at 11 is in fact a call with DGs and board chairs at 11 for one. We also have a 2-day retreat in some place called Washington, D.C. on December 8 and 9 on governance, where many of these issues are exactly on the table. And because, to end with what you started with, a lot of our documents indeed have periodical review, I think we will be able to accommodate some of these changes. We have experience for a few years now. We have ideas on how the windows were intended to be, how they are in fact working, on governance, on effectiveness and efficiency there. So yes, we hear you, the boards are certainly aware of it, and we'll use the opportunities you've provided to propose adjustments. Jonathan is one of the people I have weekly one-on-ones with.
Frank and Jonathan, my name is Simeon, and I'm the manager for the Agriculture and Rural Development Unit of South Asia, and also a former CGIAR staff where I spent like 15 years of my life working. Now, I like the idea that you put forward on partnership, which is quite significant and very important. In this job where I am now, over the past like 3 years, working as manager for one of the largest portfolio in agriculture in the World Bank, and we have like a commitment of about 8 billion or so in South Asia. One of the biggest challenges that we faced, not that we didn't try, is actually how to work effectively with the CGIAR. Okay, a place like India, where all the CGIAR centers are gathered, in the ICR and everything, all the normal physical infrastructure are there. We have not been able to really make it happen. Not that we didn't try. So, as a CEO of the consortium, I won't put it as a question, but rather as an encouragement, to try to see how we can make it, make it a priority, try to see how effectively, this partnership can actually work. I know there are different incentives because we're talking about providing resources for countries and so on, the short-term, long-term goals and so on. But there could really be opportunity where there could be some mapping, okay, where the different streams can work together. So it would really be good if maybe you can make that as one of your priorities. And we certainly at the bank, one initiative levels, like that thing happen, but not to the scale that we think that, it can really, lead to some meaningful engagement. Okay, so this is my little suggestion. Okay, she will try to see how to make that happen. Not that the bank and the CGIAR, I've not thought about that. I mean, I was part of a meeting, maybe like in 2001 or 2 here at World Bank when I was in CGIAR, where we talked about that and we discussed strategies about how to work together, but it didn't happen. So, anyway, this is just some comment to tell you that there's a lot of resources, money out there,
Yep.
people willing to work together, but it's not happening.
Yep.
Just before Frank answers that, any other question?
Well, it's
Is there
also
time
5
or
to
do you
11.
want to go, actually?
Let's keep that as the last question,
Okay,
Jonathan.
fine, okay.
So that we have 5 minutes to walk to the other building. Thank you for that suggestion. India is not the easiest country as an example. In a way, in Africa, I think the CAADP process, the CAADP CGIAR alignment, in a way, is doing what you're suggesting. And I must say, I see indeed better examples of how, say, USAID is working both with its missions and then involving CG centers in Africa. Better examples than I indeed know of India. I guess in part because in India there is such high capacity without the CG that in times, when I think of India, I more often think of Indian research institutes coming to help us out in Africa rather than us having to go to India to help them. But at the same time, the Indian government has invited CIMIT to come and build a big new center in Bihar. So there are some fairly large-scale direct national government to center initiatives at a very high level. So I think there are opportunities there. I thank you for pointing that out. We might need something similar to CAADP in other regions as well to sort of align what we're doing with what bank is doing, what other donors are doing. I certainly would see a lot of value for that there. And in fact, in Latin America, there were some voices as well, like couldn't we do something like that there? People are a bit jealous of what's happening in Africa in some ways. Leave it at that for now. And
Okay, well, on behalf of everybody, let me thank you, Frank, for giving us your time and your wisdom and your update. And we look forward, hopefully, one of these, maybe in a year's time or something, you'll come back and give us another update.
yes, you
so
can hold me accountable then.
Yes. So let's show our appreciation to Frank and look forward to the next time.